The night air was crisp, the city streets slick from an earlier rain. Officer Jake Reynolds sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, the low hum of the engine filling the silence. Beside him, Shadow sat alert, his dark eyes scanning the streets as if reading the city's pulse. The German Shepherd was more than a partner. He was family. For years, they had walked this path together, through the quiet nights and the stormy ones, through routine patrols and the ones that had left scars. Jake reached over, ruffling Shadow's thick fur. "Just another quiet shift, huh, boy?" he muttered. Shadow flicked his ears, letting out a soft huff, his tail wagging once before he resumed his vigilant stance. The radio crackled to life. "All units, disturbance reported at Crestmore Warehouse. Possible break-in, suspects armed. Proceed with caution." Jake's muscles tensed as he reached for the radio. "Unit 12 responding. ETA 5 minutes." Shadow let out a low, barely audible growl, his instincts already sensing the shift in energy. Jake didn't need words to understand him. They had been through too much for that. Flipping on the sirens, he pressed the whisk, weaving through the dimly lit streets. Crestmore Warehouse was tucked away on the industrial side of town, surrounded by towering steel structures and narrow alleys that swallowed light whole. Something didn't sit right in Jake's gut. A simple break-in didn't usually warrant an armed suspect's warning. His grip on the wheel tightened. Shadow shifted in his seat, nose twitching, already attuned to the tension in the air. As they approached the warehouse, Jake killed the siren, slowing the car to a crawl. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the massive, rusting structure ahead. A single light flickered above the entrance, casting eerie shadows that stretched unnaturally across the cracked pavement. The silence was suffocating. No movement, no getaway car, no sign of forced entry. Jake grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, Unit 12 on site, no visual on suspects. Investigating." Stepping out, he reached for his holster, his other hand tightening on Shadow's leash. The dog was already on edge, his body rigid, ears perked forward like finely tuned antennas. They moved in sync, stepping cautiously toward the entrance. Shadow's nails clicked against the concrete, a sharp contrast to the dead silence of the warehouse yard. Jake's breath plumed in the cold air as he reached for the door handle. He could feel Shadow's steady presence beside him, the dog's muscles coiled like a spring. Then, from somewhere deep inside the warehouse, a sound shattered the silence. A single gunshot. Jake barely had time to react before Shadow lunged forward, his instincts razor-sharp. The night, once quiet and still, erupted into chaos. The warehouse loomed over them, its rusted walls whispering secrets in the cold wind. Jake moved cautiously, his boots crunching over gravel, his breath steady but alert. Shadow padded beside him, every muscle in his powerful frame coiled like a spring. The dog's ears flicked forward, nose twitching, reading the air in a way Jake never could. Years on the force had taught him to trust his gut. But Shadow? Shadow's instincts were something beyond that, something primal, something absolute. And right now, every fiber of the dog's body was screaming a warning. Jake felt it too, the way the night seemed too still, too hollow. No sign of movement, no shattered glass, no forced entry. Yet, something was off. He reached for his radio, but before he could press the button, Shadow let out a sudden, low growl. It wasn't aggression, it was a warning. Then chaos erupted. Gunfire split the silence, cracking through the air like a whip. Instinct took over. Jake dove for cover behind a stack of wooden crates just as bullets tore through the night. The warehouse lit up in bursts of muzzle flashes, the sharp scent of gunpowder filling his lungs. Shadow snarled, his body low, teeth bared. "Shadow, stay!" Jake barked, but the dog had already made his move. Like a bullet himself, Shadow lunged toward the darkness, zigzagging through the open space, a ghost in the night. He was fast, faster than any man could react. A figure in the shadows cursed as Shadow's jaws clamped down, a pained scream following. But the gunfire didn't stop. Jake pressed his back against the crate, breath heavy, adrenaline hammering through his veins. He peeked out just enough to see 2, maybe 3 figures moving behind the machinery. This wasn't a random break-in, it was a setup. A second gunshot. Sharp. Too close. Pain exploded in Jake's side, white-hot and blinding. The force sent him sprawling onto the cold concrete, his breath ripped from his lungs. He gasped, the taste of iron flooding his mouth. The world spun, and for a moment all he could hear was the distant echo of sirens, growing too far away like they'd never reach him in time. Then a shadow loomed over him, snarling, growling, fierce as a storm. Shadow. The dog stood over Jake's body, his fangs bared, his growl so deep it rumbled through the ground beneath them. His body moved with precise, trained aggression, shielding his fallen handler from the advancing figures. Jake tried to move, tried to reach for his gun, but his limbs felt like lead. He could barely whisper the words. Good boy. Shadow braced himself, his eyes locked on the enemy. He wasn't backing down. Not tonight, not ever. The world around him blurred, the cold pavement pressed against Jake's back, its unforgiving surface soaking up the warmth from his body. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, each one more labored than the last. He tried to move, tried to press his hand against the wound in his side, but his limbs wouldn't listen. Blood seeped through his fingers, dark and slick, pooling beneath him like ink spreading across a blank page. The night sky above him felt too far away, distant and hazy, the stars fading into the blackness at the edges of his vision. He could hear his own heartbeat, sluggish and uneven, a dull thudding in his ears. His fingers twitched against the pavement. He knew. Shadow's whine cut through the fog in his mind, a desperate, pleading sound. Warm breath ghosted against his cheek as the dog nosed his face, frantic, trying to rouse him. Jake blinked, his vision struggling to focus. Shadow's dark eyes stared back, wide and filled with something Jake had never seen in them before, fear. Shadow. The word came out broken, barely a whisper. The dog let out a sharp bark, his body shifting closer, pressing against Jake's chest as if his weight alone could hold him here, keep him tethered to this world. He nudged Jake's shoulder, whimpering when he didn't respond fast enough. Jake forced his hand to move, to reach up, his fingers brushing through Shadow's thick fur. It was warm, steady, alive. The pain in his side burned hotter, like fire licking at his ribs. He coughed, the taste of copper filling his mouth, and the effort left him dizzy. His grip on Shadow's fur weakened. No! Shadow growled, low and desperate, his body shifting, his eyes darting between Jake and the empty darkness beyond them. The gunmen were gone. The silence was worse than the gunfire. Jake's fingers curled weakly, barely holding on to Shadow now. His mind felt heavy, the pull of unconsciousness dragging at him. He knew he wouldn't last much longer. His chest rose in a shallow breath, then another. Each one felt thinner, weaker, like the spaces between them were growing longer. Shadow whined again, his tail low, his body trembling. He pawed at Jake's chest, desperate for movement, desperate for anything but the stillness settling over his handler. Jake swallowed hard, summoning what little strength he had left. His lips parted, his voice hoarse, barely a breath. Stay, boy. Stay with me. Shadow let out a whimper, pressing his head against Jake's hand as it finally went slack. The night stretched on, cold and indifferent, and Shadow, his ever-loyal partner, never left his side. The flashing red and blue lights painted the dark alley in pulses of color, their glow reflecting off the wet pavement. The wail of approaching sirens grew louder. Filling the empty night with an urgency that had come too late, Jake lay still, his body motionless against the cold concrete, his uniform soaked in blood. And Shadow refused to leave his side. His body was low, tense, head lowered over Jake's chest, his ears pinned back. His breathing was heavy, nostrils flaring, his instincts screaming at him that this wasn't right. His handler wasn't moving. The steady rhythm of Jake's voice, the commands that had guided him for years, were gone. All that remained was silence, and Shadow didn't know how to make sense of it. The first paramedic rushed forward, medical bag in hand, but the second he stepped too close, Shadow let out a deep, guttural growl. It was not the warning of a dog who had been startled, nor the aggression of one ready to attack. It was the sound of something raw, something wounded. A promise. No one was taking Jake from him. Hold up, one of the officers called, raising a hand to stop the paramedics. Give me a second. Officer Briggs, one of Jake's closest friends on the force, approached cautiously. He had worked with Shadow before, knew the unbreakable bond he shared with his handler. His heart twisted at the sight before him. Shadow, Briggs said softly, taking slow steps forward. The dog's eyes flicked to him, his body still rigid with tension, but his tail did not wag. It remained low, stiff, signaling his distress. He wasn't listening. He wasn't letting go. Briggs took a knee, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know, buddy. I know you don't want to leave him, but we have to help Jake." His words were met with another low growl, not of anger, but of grief. Shadow shifted, his body pressing closer to Jake's, his nose nudging his shoulder as if trying to wake him up. The paramedic stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Shadow had been trained to protect his handler at all costs. But how did you tell a dog that there was nothing left to protect? A murmur ran through the officers who had gathered, watching the heartbreaking standoff unfold. Some looked away, the weight of the moment too heavy to bear. Others clenched their jaws, swallowing back the emotion that threatened to break through. The ambulance doors remained open, the stretcher waiting. But Shadow did not move. The world around him blurred into meaningless noise. Voices, sirens, movement, but none of it mattered. His handler was still here, and that meant he had a job to do. Briggs exhaled, blinking back the sting in his eyes. "All right, boy," he murmured, reaching out carefully. "If you won't leave him, then we'll take you both." As the paramedics hesitated, Briggs nodded toward them. "Load them together." Shadow stayed right where he was as they lifted Jake onto the stretcher, his body shifting only slightly, as if adjusting to keep his weight against his partner. When the wheels began to move, Shadow moved with them, his paws clicking against the pavement. He would not be left behind. Not now. Not ever. The wheels of the stretcher rattled over the uneven pavement, a hollow sound swallowed by the wail of sirens and the murmurs of officers who had gathered in solemn silence. The night still clung to the city, heavy and suffocating, but Shadow moved as though the weight of the world pressed down on him alone. His paws matched the rhythm of the stretcher's slow movement, his gaze locked onto the still body of his handler, his breath coming in short, uneven huffs. No one dared stop him. Officers lined the path leading to the ambulance, their faces set in a mix of grief and reverence. They had seen plenty of loss before, had witnessed tragedy unfold in 1,000 different ways. But this was different. This wasn't just a fallen officer being taken from the scene. This was a partner being left behind. Shadow stayed close, his steps never faltering, his body never straying from Jake's side. When the stretcher reached the ambulance, a paramedic hesitated, glancing at the officers as if searching for an answer to a question he didn't know how to ask. Briggs stepped forward. "Let him in." The words were barely spoken before Shadow leaped into the ambulance, settling at Jake's feet, his body curled just enough that his head rested against his handler's boot. He did not move. He did not make a sound. The paramedics worked around him, securing IV lines and checking vitals, but Shadow remained still, his entire world condensed to the fading scent of the man he had spent his life protecting. The ride to the hospital was silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor, each note like a cruel ticking clock. Shadow didn't flinch. He only listened, his ears twitching at every change, every dip in rhythm, as though he could will the machine to keep going, to keep Jake tethered to this world just a little longer. When the ambulance doors opened, he moved again, following as they wheeled Jake inside. He was stopped at the ICU doors, a firm but gentle hand pressing against his chest. "We have to take him now," the nurse said softly, her voice thick with understanding. Shadow did not growl. He did not fight. He only stood there watching as they disappeared behind the doors, his tail hanging low, his ears flicking forward as if waiting for a sound, any sound, that would tell him his handler was coming back. The waiting room was too bright, too sterile, too empty. Officers lingered nearby, whispering to one another, but Shadow didn't acknowledge them. His eyes never left the door. Minutes stretched into hours, and still he did not move. Then the door opened. A doctor emerged, pulling his mask down, his face lined with exhaustion. The officers rose to their feet, their bodies rigid as they braced for the words they already knew were coming. "I'm sorry," the doctor said. A quiet gasp passed through the room. Someone cursed under their breath. Someone else wiped at their face. The world seemed to tilt slightly, like the ground itself had shifted beneath them. Shadow blinked. His tail did not move. His ears did not twitch. For a long moment, it seemed as though he hadn't heard at all. But then his body tensed. His chest expanded with a deep breath, his nose lifting slightly as if searching for a scent that was already fading. Then it came. A sound so raw, so broken that it cut through every voice, every whisper, every ounce of composure left in the room. Shadow threw his head back and howled. It was long, hollow, a cry of grief so deep it settled into the bones of every person who heard it. It was the sound of loss, of knowing that the one he had spent his life protecting was gone. And yet he did not leave. Long after the doctors walked away, after the officers stood in silence, after the world outside continued without pause, Shadow remained, his body still facing the doors, his howl echoing through the empty halls, because somewhere in the space beyond those doors lay the only partner he had ever known. And Shadow wasn't ready to say goodbye. The sky hung heavy with gray, the clouds pressing down like a weight on the gathered officers standing in their sharp-dressed uniforms. The air was thick, still, the kind of silence that made everything feel unreal, as if time had stopped in respect for the man they had come to honor. Rows of polished badges glinted under the muted light, each one a reflection of the sacrifice they had all sworn to make. At the center of it all stood Shadow. The funeral had drawn officers from across the state, each one coming to pay their respects to a man who had been more than just a brother in blue. But as the honor guard prepared to move, as the slow, solemn procession began toward the gravesite, Shadow did not move. He sat there beside the casket, his dark eyes locked on the draped flag that covered it. Briggs, standing closest, took a step forward. His voice was low, coaxing. "Come on, boy." Shadow didn't so much as flick an ear. He remained still, his posture unreadable, his breathing deep but steady. It was as if he was waiting, waiting for the hand that would never pat his head again, waiting for the voice that would never call his name. The officers around him shifted uncomfortably, their composure wavering at the sight. They had all seen loss before. They had carried their own ghosts. But there was something about this. Something about the way Shadow refused to move, about the way he sat there like a silent guardian, that made it impossible to look away. The bagpipes started. A long, mournful note cut through the still air, followed by the slow, aching melody of Amazing Grace. The sound curled through the cemetery, touching everything, sinking into bones, into hearts. It was too much. Shadow let out a soft, low whine, the first sound he had made since he arrived. His head dipped, his ears flattening, and then, with deliberate slowness, he lowered himself to the ground. His body curled slightly, but it was his head that broke them all, resting gently against the wood of the coffin, his breath shallow, his eyes half closed. A choked sob came from somewhere in the crowd. Someone turned away, swallowing hard. Even the officers who had spent years mastering their emotions, who had buried friends and stood through dozens of funerals, found themselves blinking too much, fists clenched too tight. No one spoke. No one moved to stop him. Shadow stayed there, unmoving, as the final notes of the song drifted into the sky. Even as the honor guard prepared the flag, as rifles were raised for the final salute, as taps began to play, Shadow remained, his head resting in quiet, loyal grief. Because even now, when the world was telling him it was over, he refused to say goodbye. The house was quiet, too quiet. Briggs pushed the door open, letting Shadow step inside first. The dog hesitated, his paws barely crossing the threshold as his nose twitched, searching for something that wasn't there. The familiar scent of Jake still clung to the air, on the couch where he used to sit, in the hallway where his boots had always rested, in the jacket still hanging by the door. It was everywhere, but it was wrong. It was fading. Shadow padded forward slowly, his claws clicking against the hardwood floor, his body tense with uncertainty. He sniffed the air again, as if trying to make sense of it, as if waiting for something to shift. for Jake's voice to call him over, for the familiar weight of a hand to ruffle his fur. But nothing came. Briggs lingered by the door, watching as the K9 moved through the house. He had seen dogs mourn before. He had seen them wait by windows, whine at doors, curl up beside uniforms that no longer carried warmth. But watching Shadow now, seeing the way he kept glancing toward the front door as if expecting it to open, as if Jake was just late coming home, sent a hollow ache deep into his chest. Shadow made his way to the living room, his head tilting slightly at the couch. He stared at it for a long moment before stepping forward and pressing his nose against the armrest, inhaling deeply. His tail gave the slightest wag, just a twitch, before going still. Then just as quickly he turned away, pacing back toward the door, waiting, watching. Hours passed, but he did not rest. When night fell, the house felt colder. Shadow moved through it like a ghost, his presence as silent as the absence that surrounded him. The lights from passing cars flickered against the walls, stretching long shadows across the room. He found his way to the bedroom. The sheets on Jake's side of the bed were still slightly rumpled, just as he had left them that morning. Shadow hesitated at the doorway, his ears flicking forward, waiting. But the bed did not shift. The familiar weight did not settle into it. Slowly he stepped closer, climbing onto the mattress. He turned in a slow, tight circle before lowering himself down. His head rested on the empty space beside him, his breath warm against the fabric that still smelled like home. He did not sleep. His eyes remained open, staring at the door, his body tense with expectation. He listened for footsteps, for the sound of keys jangling, for the soft clearing of a throat before a familiar voice would murmur, "Come here, boy." But the house remained silent, and Shadow kept waiting. The house was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. The night stretched on, heavy and endless, wrapping the empty rooms in a suffocating stillness. Shadow lay curled at the foot of the bed, his eyes open, watching the door with quiet patience. He did not sleep. He never did, not since Jake had left and never come back. The scent of his handler still lingered, though fainter now, slipping away like something fragile carried by the wind. Shadow shifted, his nose twitching as he inhaled deeply, trying to hold on to it. Then something changed. A sound barely audible came from the front of the house. A whisper of movement, or maybe just a feeling, one Shadow couldn't explain, but one he understood. His ears perked. His muscles stiffened. He rose slowly, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor as he moved toward the hallway. The police jacket still hung by the door, the same way Jake had left it. The fabric swayed slightly, as if disturbed by an unseen force. Shadow stopped, his head lowering, his body coiling with tension. Then suddenly he let out a sharp bark. It cut through the silence like a blade. He barked again, louder this time, his tail stiff, his eyes locked onto the jacket. His breath came in short, sharp huffs, his nose flaring as he stepped closer. He sniffed once, then twice. Something wasn't right. The next moment, he bolted. Briggs nearly dropped his coffee when the phone rang in the dead of night. Calls at this hour were never good news. He grabbed his keys before he even answered. When he arrived, Shadow was no longer inside the house. The door was still shut, but the dog was gone. Briggs scanned the yard, his pulse quickening. Then he heard it, the frantic sound of barking, coming from the driveway. Shadow stood beside Jake's old patrol car, his front paws braced against the door, his claws scraping at the metal. His breath came in fast, urgent puffs, his tail stiff, his entire body tense with frustration. Briggs stepped closer, his brows furrowed. "What is it, boy?" Shadow barked again, then pressed his nose against the door handle, whining, his body shifting with agitation. He wasn't just reacting. He had found something. Briggs crouched beside the car, running his hand along the frame. That's when he saw it, a small gap beneath the driver's seat, just barely visible, just barely out of sight. His breath caught. With steady hands, he reached inside, his fingers brushing against something hard, something cold. He pulled it out slowly, and when he looked down, his stomach tightened. A flash drive. Shadow let out a soft huff, his eyes locked onto Briggs. There was something on that drive, something Jake had left behind, and somehow Shadow had known exactly where to find it. The flash drive felt impossibly small in Briggs' hands, yet it carried a weight that pressed down on his chest like a stone. The cold night air did nothing to steady his pulse as he turned it over between his fingers. Shadow sat beside him, panting lightly, his sharp eyes locked onto the object, as if waiting for Briggs to understand what he already knew. Jake had left something behind, something important, and Shadow had been the only one to see what everyone else had missed. Briggs exhaled, his breath visible in the night air. He wasted no time. Sliding into the patrol car, he plugged the drive into the onboard laptop. The screen flickered, the loading bar crawling forward until a list of files popped up. At first, it seemed like routine casework. Reports, timestamps, officer statements, nothing unusual. But as he scrolled deeper, the entries changed. Hidden between the official reports were files Jake had never submitted, witness testimonies that contradicted the ones on record, surveillance footage flagged as inconclusive, a list of names, some familiar, others sending an unsettling chill through Briggs as he read them. Jake had been investigating something on his own, something big, and someone had wanted it buried. Briggs's gut twisted as he clicked on a video file. The grainy footage loaded, showing the back of a dimly lit alley. A timestamp in the corner marked it just weeks before Jake's death. The camera was shaky, as if taken from a hidden body cam or a phone held just out of sight. A group of men stood huddled in conversation. One of them turned slightly, and Briggs' breath caught in his throat. It was Captain Monroe, the man who had given Jake his last assignment, the man who had stood at his funeral, eyes dry, voice steady, speaking about loyalty and sacrifice. Briggs clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the laptop. Jake had found something, something worth risking everything for. And now, thanks to Shadow, that truth was no longer buried beneath a car seat. Shadow whined softly beside him, nudging his knee, sensing the shift in his handler's energy. Briggs reached down, running a hand through the thick fur between Shadow's ears. "You knew, didn't you?" His voice was quiet, filled with something heavier than grief. Shadow huffed, his tail flicking once against the car floor. Briggs grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Detective Briggs. I need you to notify the chief immediately. We're reopening Jake Reynolds' case. Effective now." Silence held for a moment before the response crackled back. "Copy that, Detective." Briggs looked down at Shadow, his eyes dark with determination. Jake had been chasing the truth. And now, with Shadow leading the way, Briggs was going to finish what he started. The courtroom was silent, save for the steady ticking of the clock on the far wall. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of months of investigation pressing down on everyone in the room. Captain Monroe sat at the defense table, his face unreadable, but his hands told the truth, clenched into fists, the tension clear in his knuckles. Briggs stood near the prosecution's table, arms crossed, his gaze steady. Shadow sat beside him, his dark eyes locked onto Monroe, the same unwavering focus he had carried since the night Jake died. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he looked over the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" A woman in the front row stood, her voice steady despite the emotion rippling through the room. "We have, Your Honor." The silence stretched thick and suffocating until the words finally came. "Guilty." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Monroe's jaw tightened, his mask of calm cracking for the first time. He had thought he had covered his tracks, that Jake's suspicions had died with him. But Shadow had never let the truth rest. He had led Briggs to the missing evidence, forced open a case no one wanted to touch, and now justice was finally being served. Briggs let out a slow breath, resting a hand on Shadow's back. "You did it, boy," he murmured. Shadow remained still, watching as Monroe was led away in handcuffs. It wasn't a celebration, it wasn't victory, but it was justice, and it was what Jake would have wanted. A week later, they gathered again, this time not in a courtroom, but at a memorial. Officers from across the city stood in silent rows, their badges gleaming in the afternoon sun. The folded flag that had once rested on Jake's casket was now being presented to his family. Shadow sat at the front, a polished medal hanging from his collar, the highest honor a K9 could receive. The chief of police had insisted on it. Shadow wasn't just a partner. He was a hero. Briggs knelt beside him, adjusting the ribbon. "You earned this," he said softly. But Shadow didn't react. His eyes were on the door of the station behind them, ears flicking at every sound. Waiting, watching. Because even with the case closed, even with the truth uncovered, some part of him still believed Jake was coming back. That any moment now he would walk through that door, his voice breaking through the silence, calling his name. Briggs exhaled, running a hand through Shadow's fur. "I know, buddy," he whispered. "I miss him too." Shadow let out a soft sigh, lowering his head. He would wait as long as it took, because some bonds never break, not even in death. Shadow remained by the station doors, his gaze unwavering, his breath steady. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavement, but he didn't move. Officers passed by, some pausing, some watching, all knowing exactly why he was there. He was waiting, because even though Jake was gone, even though the case was closed, Shadow still held on to something stronger than loss. Loyalty, love, the kind of bond that time, distance, even death couldn't break. Briggs sat down beside him, exhaling slowly as he scratched behind Shadow's ears. "He'd be proud of you," he murmured. "We all are." Shadow blinked but didn't shift, his eyes still fixed on the door. Because in his heart, Jake was still there. He would always be there, and so Shadow would keep waiting. Keep watching. Because that's what partners do. If this story moved you, if you believe in the unbreakable bond between a K9 and their handler, then don't let this be the last time we share a story like this. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and be part of our community dedicated to honoring the loyalty, courage, and sacrifice of heroes like Jake in Shadow. Their story doesn't end here, and neither should yours. Stay with us, because more powerful stories are coming. Subscribe now.